The changes in the education sector, the way we assess students, the rise of digitalization and artificial intelligence, the changes in the learning environment, and many other unusual and controversial questions. We will be examining them one after the other in this channel. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and this is Education Chatter. Welcome to Education Chatter. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski. I'm your host, and today I'm with a renowned expert in education, especially in shadow education, Professor Mark Bray from University of Hong Kong. Mark Bray is originally from the United Kingdom. He is a renowned expert in shadow education, expert within all kinds of all working groups of UNESCO. And Mark has agreed to speak to us. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to spread some messages.
The most interesting part, I wanted to start with your personal story, Mark, because the most important part about everything related to education are the personal stories. Education is really something that changes our lives. But I hear in your career that you have been a teacher. You have been a teacher in many low-income countries, in Kenya, Papua New Guinea, and so on. What was your experience back then? When was that really? And what was your experience back then?
That was quite a few decades ago. And in fact, I was a volunteer teacher in rural schools, filling gaps. Shadow education didn't come into the equation at that time. I was plugging gaps. I was reducing the inequalities and working as an idealistic volunteer in very low-income countries. And it was a fascinating and life-changing experience, which continues to mean a lot to me.
Right. I think that, one thing that's, every time I travel to low-income countries, one thing that occurs to me is always the humility and the fact that we have to be very humble, because in fact we are very privileged in the northern part of the world. So thanks a lot for sharing this. You accepted the invitation to speak about shadow education, which is your field of expertise. What is shadow education anyway?
Well, why the metaphor of a shadow? It's simply that we are talking about out-of-school supplementary tutoring, fee-paying in particular, and academic in particular. More mathematics, more languages, more sciences, etc. Why is it called a shadow? Well, simply because the curriculum shadows that of schooling. If the examination system changes in the schools, then it will change in the shadow system. Who's delivering the shadow education? It's a wide range of providers. You've got commercial companies, you've got university students and others who want a little bit of extra money. You've got people who can't otherwise find a job, so they're stopgap people. And then you also, in many countries, have teachers who are supplying extra tutoring after school to supplement their own salaries.
Correct. You see, I'm an outcome of shadow education myself. I was born in Poland in a rural area, and without shadow education, probably I would not be able to access university. I know that throughout my life, my parents spent a lot of money to actually teach me English. That's first of all, but also to help me up with, as you said, with math, because otherwise, most friends from my areas would not be able to access university, and therefore this would limit their careers. The biggest question about this is about equality. Do you think that shadow education actually fosters equality, or is it something that prevents it?
Hearing your story, and your story seems a positive one of social mobility. Perhaps in a moment you can tell me who provided the shadow education, but yours sounds like a positive story where indeed, if you learned English, you learned it very well, and you then proceeded to higher education. And in that respect, it seems a story of social mobility, helping people who otherwise would have hit a glass ceiling and would not have proceeded to university and to higher education opportunities.
That's all correct. But one thing that is missing in this part of the story is true. It is a positive story. I have learned English, plus ou moins, I would say. But at the same time, there's lots of unfortunate children that may not have or may not possess funding in order to go for shadow education, to get this kind of support. And so many opponents of shadow education would actually underline this point. What would be your take on this?
I would underline it as well. The issues of social inequality are very significant, and it's fairly obvious that the more money you have, the more quantity and the better quality of shadow education you can secure. Now, what I find interesting in your case also is that you came from a rural part of Poland, as I'm hearing it. Generally, shadow education is more easily available in urban areas because the suppliers, particularly the commercial companies, etc., are in urban areas. Can I ask you, who provided it? Was it teachers, ordinary teachers?
You know, in the rural areas, vast majority of this kind of services are actually served by teachers. Yes, so it's really teachers that, it works really with a word of mouth. In my case, my math teacher was simply a teacher in another school who wanted to make some extra money, and my English teacher was exactly again a teacher in another school. It's actually quite interesting, and I'm not sure if I should share this, but thanks to this man, I actually speak English. I was in my village. I was the best English speaker, thanks to those shadow education provision. Then I went to Warsaw to study, and I realized that I was the worst English speaker, which was quite funny. But if I would not meet that man on my way, probably I would never be able to talk to you. And that's indeed was a life-changing experience. So I could say that, of course, you know, shadow education has merits, and I totally agree with it. But at the same time, I know, you know, because I'm from rural areas, I have lots of friends that did not have this kind of funding necessary to excel. And as a result of that, many of them indeed were not having access to high level universities and to education in general. And as a result of that, their careers didn't develop like mine. I'm a very privileged man. And indeed, I think that is a very big discussion nowadays about shadow education, whether or not we should actually promote it, and whether or not this is a signal of a certain failure in education. What do you think about that?
Indeed, these are the issues. You've portrayed them very precisely. Certainly, shadow education is more likely to maintain and exacerbate social inequalities, though we equally find that dynamic immigrant families who establish themselves in foreign countries and want to get ahead just sacrifice all sorts of other things in order to invest in education, in order to move ahead. Now, the trouble is that we are in a marketized environment. So then there are questions about prices and about, you raised the question of quality. There is rather little regulation of this sector. Our schools are highly regulated. Over the decades, we have really standardized and regulated, and we have inspections and so on. The shadow sector is also in the shadows. It is mostly unregulated. Well, it's partly regulated. The businesses may be regulated as businesses, but they are less likely to be regulated as educational enterprises. University students who give it informally, there's probably no regulation. Your teachers, I'm so glad that they were good teachers. I'm reassured that they were teachers from other schools, because when they are teachers in the same schools, there are possible issues of corruption. There are even worse when teachers are tutoring their own students. There is a danger of them deliberately under-teaching during the daytime and saying, well, I haven't got time for this, the curriculum's too much, come to my house at 5 o'clock and I will give you the rest. And by the way, I'm setting the examination. So really, I think...
These kind of cases do happen.
Oh, absolutely, it happens. Now, whether it happens so much in Europe, it's more hidden, people are subtle. But it certainly happens in some of the low-income countries that in which I was teaching and in which I have been doing research. In India, in Cambodia, in Myanmar, in parts of Africa, and so on. Yes, it happens. And it's, to me, a major issue. I have written a book for UNESCO. Let me add a little of my own background. Yes, I have been working as a consultant and a project leader for UNESCO over decades now, but I also, in 2006, I became director in Paris of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, IIEP. During those years, before I returned to Hong Kong, I wrote a book called Confronting the Shadow Education System. I feel indeed that it needs to be confronted instead of just left to its own growth and evolution. It needs government confronting, but also social confronting, raising these issues. This is why I'm very glad to talk with you and to have this podcast, this video disseminated through you, just to get people to talk about it, to consider these issues and to consider what they're going to do about it.
I think, I think every parent, and I'm a parent myself, has ever been somehow confronting this question of shadow education and investing in education of your kids. And I mean, obviously speaking, if you're a parent and your child has a problem with math, you will certainly pay any money, whatever you can provide, in order to make it better. Why? Because of course we want our children to grow, we want them to excel, we want them to access university and education and excel in their professional life. But is that really, I hear, because I've been reading about the shadow education, I hear that the trends are quite upward, which means that in fact the shadow education is in the rise. Why is that so? Is that really related to quality of education? Maybe a public education is not providing correct enough education, or is not a good quality education? What's your take on this?
Well, you started that paragraph by talking about parents whose children are not doing well in mathematics, etc. Equally, you've got parents whose children are doing well in mathematics, etc. And those parents want to stretch their children further. They want to give them more education and more diversity and more stimulus. So again, that is diversification. You're correct to say that the shadow sector is growing. Worldwide, people think particularly about my part of the world, meaning East Asia. They think about Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, Japan, Korea, etc. That's where the shadow education has been booming since the 1980s, 1990s, etc. Now, in the present century, it has become a global phenomenon, including here in Europe, but with diversity. And so Southern Europe's different from Eastern Europe, which is different from Western Europe, which is different from Northern Europe.
Can you elaborate on those differences? So if I'm from Eastern Europe, how is it in Eastern Europe?
The big driver in Eastern Europe was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. In the Soviet Union, there was shadow education, but it was very much frowned upon, private sector extra tutoring, and it was seriously hidden and downplayed. With the collapse of the Soviet Union became collapse of teachers' salaries. Mm-hmm. Teachers then needed extra incomes, and shadow education was an obvious way to secure extra incomes. Families understood that. They knew that their teachers were not well paid. Many teachers completely left the profession. That also led to deterioration of quality. So that huge political crisis in Eastern Europe was a major push for the growth of the parallel shadow sector. And once it got there, then it entered the culture. And this is another of the issues. Once it's in the culture, then it's very hard to eradicate it from the culture.
You're right. Just, I will try to maybe debate with you a little bit. And again, this is not something that I have researched, but I do have a personal story in there. And I could tell you that, at least as far as I remember, I remember early 1990s. I don't remember, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I was a little child back then. But I do remember early 1990s and the transformation. And at least in the rural areas, the teachers in schools were considered, they were having sort of a role of university professors in big cities. They were people of knowledge. They were people of so they were people of, let's say, let's call it higher middle class. And in many places, especially in the villages that let's say a village that I come from, where there was unemployment, being a teacher was a very good profession to have, because you were very respected. You were maybe poorly paid, but you did have a job. And somehow you were having this role of an intellectual in a society, in a community. And that's something that I remember from 1990s, where indeed there was a huge unemployment in my original country, Poland. And I remember that in many families, teachers, which predominantly are women, were the breadwinners. And on top of it, yes, this entire shadow education has emerged back then as well. And because of this, let's say, geographical exclusion, let's go it this way. Because in bigger cities, yes, you are having pretty good schools, and if you would have children, you could put them there. But in rural areas, in order to get a place at the university, which normally is in bigger cities, you really need to excel. And there is a geographical dimension to it as well. So just wanted to share this story as well, that I have my personal opinion on this as well.
It's valuable. What I would also point out, the figures that I see from Poland, but perhaps more urban Poland, are 52% of children these days receiving shadow education. 52% is a lot. It's more than half.
Every second child. And how is it in the richer parts of Europe? How is it? You say that in Western Europe and in Northern Europe it's slightly different. But why in the richest part of the world shadow education still is a significant factor?
Well, let me start historically in Southern Europe. It's highest in Greece, in Cyprus, in Malta, in Southern Europe. Why? Again, for political reasons. Greece has its turbulent political history of teachers being part of the regime or not being part of the regime. And when they're pushed out, then they have to earn extra incomes, and tutoring is a strong way to do it. And it has become very established in the Greek culture, and the Cypriots are related to the Greeks. And so something like 80% plus 90% of senior secondary students receive shadow education. It has become normalized.
Right.
Western Europe, it has just developed just because of neoliberalism, private enterprise, the acceptability that education can be a service that is paid for, that is not simply a state responsibility in the school. The idea that parents should take responsibility for their children, and so on. So Western Europe, it's boomed, not yet to the Greek or the Cypriot levels, but like in France, I'm seeing something like 25% or more, and in Paris, higher than elsewhere. And then even in Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, which used to be famed for the quality of their education, for saying schools are adequate, they're enough, they are good quality schools, even there, schooling is perceived as needing supplementation, particularly for the lower achievers. Now, there are parents who want to keep ahead, Perhaps in the Scandinavian countries, they're more shy about that, and at least they don't advertise it so much. But even in the Scandinavian countries, shadow education has emerged and is growing. And there I come back to an earlier question about why it's growing, and I would just highlight social competition. In the old days, we were just competing with our neighbors, with other people in our own countries. Now we are competing across national boundaries. The European Union is partly about that, about migration of people. And so social competition has greatly intensified, and families have to handle it. So it's intensified not just for migration, but also for technology. Things move around at the click of a computer mouse, not just with a human being.
Do I understand correctly that well, social media did increase the exchange of information, but it's also resulted in, because of the exchange of information and intense exchange of information, we also have a situation that people are more competitive. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And some of the tutorial companies build on that. It has been called an anxiety industry. The tutoring companies will advertise the competition. Parents, don't neglect your child. We've got a competitive world here. And fortunately, my company is here to help you. So in that sense, it's deliberately an anxiety industry exacerbated by the companies and their advertising.
Mm-hmm. And is that so? So it's an anxiety business. Very interesting. So in other words, you want to say that if your child will not be participating in extracurricular activities at my school, that child will actually lag behind. Is that correct?
That's the sort of thing that the companies will tell you. Yes, they will tell you that for sure.
But then is this, you mentioned this a little bit here, and it seems that indeed in each part of Europe it's slightly different. But still, I have a feeling here that the vast majority of those shadow schools are really designed for those people that are, let's say, well, have certain educational difficulties. If so, if we would see it from this perspective, then shadow schools actually contribute to equality principles and not the other way around. If someone has money or has enough money to do this, and they indeed have well, a child who is somehow lagging behind the public education, in the public education or private education, and whatever this child attends, then this kind of schools, the shadow education, can actually support that child. Is that correct?
It is correct that some types of shadow education can have very desirable educational consequences supporting children. It's also correct that as other shadow education increases inequalities, that the higher achievers, statistically around the world, it's more likely to be accessed by higher achievers than by lower achievers. Why? Because the parents are alert. Those are the sorts of families that think about these issues, that have high aspirations, that use shadow education to consolidate their social position. It's make it a glass floor for them as well as a glass ceiling for others, and to get ahead. So it creates a lot of social inequalities and exacerbates them.
All right. How is it in different parts of the world? You say that in Asia, this was historically, this phenomenon was even more predominant than in Europe.
Well, South Korea is a remarkable country if you think of its trajectory. It was a complete mess at the end of the Korean War in the 1950s. South Korea then rose, boomed, is now an OECD country. Why and how education in general has contributed to that, including shadow education. So it has given skills to the economy, and combined with diligence is a reason for South Korea to boom. Now, I think there are cultural elements here. People talk about Confucian heritage cultures, and so that's where Korea would fit in, so would mainland China, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. So that's where we also have cultural dimensions in the phenomenon, which can also be considered.
And I have another question. I have a question that is, again, provocative. Can you imagine a world in which shadow education becomes so dominant that it would be somehow overtaking or would be somehow competing with general education, with the highly regularized education? You mentioned here that one of the advantages that shadow education have on the market side, let's say, is that they are not regulated. The schools are highly regulated. Universities are highly regulated. They have a lot of legislation that they have to comply with. Whereas if you're a new provider of education and you don't have any regularization on it, so in fact you're less costly, can they actually overtake? Can we actually experience a mercantilization of education because of shadow education?
We can, and we do. So there are two aspects here. One is external competition with the schools. So that links back to an earlier point you were making. Shadow education can also make the life of a school teacher more difficult, because the teacher then has got children in the class, some of whom have got the supplementary tutoring, some of whom haven't, some of whom are stretching further ahead. It can increase the diversity within the classroom, but it can also reduce the diversity if the slow achievers receive the support. But then there are also different ways, for example, of learning mathematics, and it drives sometimes maths teachers crazy. They want to teach maths in one way, and the tutor wants to teach maths in another way, and that can lead to confusion, and it can lead to over-dependence. The child can be over-dependent on the tutor. But now to your more recent question, absolutely, we are seeing in parts of the world places where the shadow becomes the body and the school becomes the shadow. At the examination season, I'm thinking of countries like Turkey, Egypt, India. When it comes to the examination time, the children stop going to school. School is just a boring place, or it's a place to socialize. You get the real stuff in the tutoring sector. What's left for the school is simply the regulation saying you have to have something like 75% attendance to sit the exam. Okay, tick that box, but then fall asleep during the class if you really have to go to the class. But the students may respect the tutor more than they respect the teacher. And I can give you empirical evidence on students skipping school in order to go to the shadow sector.
That's very interesting. I wanted to link it maybe with another topic, which well, I didn't expect to discuss here, but it occurred to my mind right now. There's also a new trend about homeschooling. You could imagine a combination of these two. That if I am a homeschooling father and I have my children at home to school them, and to teach them, not to school them, to teach them. And of course, because of that, my children anyway will have to attend certain national exams in order to pass to further steps of education. And I could use shadow education as a support. Do you have any I don't know, empirical evidence that this kind of cooperation or practice occur?
It is occurring. Homeschooling, as you say, is growing in some parts of the world. It's been in the United States for a long time and in a few other parts of the world, but it's still very small scale. But certainly, if indeed one is homeschooling, then one can look for the shadow sector. Now, all the time in this conversation, we've also been talking mostly about, or by implication, about in-person, face-to-face tutoring. But the internet has enormously changed things. So now you can get your classes online, and you can get them unchanged by geographic factors. So you can still be in rural Poland, but you can still have the tutor in Warsaw, or you can indeed have the tutor in India, the United States, Australia, anywhere else on the planet. So technology has enormously changed this pattern, and it's another complicating or facilitating factor, depending on how you want to look at it.
It also cuts costs for those that provide shadow education. I can tell you that my My teacher, I'm taking some language classes. Well, he lives in Sweden, although he's a French teacher, which is a very, very interesting situation, because indeed all the classes are actually taking place online. So we mentioned a little bit one topic that I still want to discuss here. So we discussed the marketalization of education, the fact that there are situations in which shadow education becomes the body, as you said. But at the same time, I wanted to mention, because you mentioned somewhere in our discussion about the corruption of teachers. How does it really occur? If you could maybe elaborate on this. The corruption of teachers that also do tutoring, and somehow they I don't know, they kind of try to convince the parents that the children need more tutoring that is paid, because they do not manage to teach them this in the public school.
That is a phenomenon which we see in various countries, in Egypt, in Cambodia, Myanmar, parts of India, as I have mentioned. Could happen in Europe as much. Well, perhaps not as much, but it could still happen in Europe, where teachers who get their salaries anyway don't put a lot of effort into their daytime classes, that they put more effort into their private schools, private jobs, their private tutoring, where the clients depend on the quality and the energy of the teachers. So teachers may relax rather during the ordinary school time and put their energies into the extra tutoring. But even more problematic, as I have mentioned, is teachers who tutor their existing students. Now, some teachers do it for very positive reasons. Again, I have to be careful not to malign the teaching profession altogether. Teachers may say, look, I know this child. I know that she or he has got this problem in mathematics or language or biology, whatever it is. I already know the child. Let me just have some extra time after school to help the child. And we see that in many countries. We have got good teachers who are doing it for reputable and meaningful reasons. But the corruption side can still be there, where teachers deliberately relax their in-school teaching in order to promote that out-of-school marketplace.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Professor Bray, I have to wrap it up, I wanted to ask you the main question of today. If you could simply elaborate about it, but it's also a question for our viewers. If you would like to, so now I will turn to our viewers and I will ask you, what do you think about shadow education? Is it actually a positive phenomenon or negative phenomenon? Is it actually a phenomenon that underlines and proves that the education or general education or public education systems fail? Or is it something that is actually positive, that fosters equality, that fosters social cohesion or mobility of students from all kinds of backgrounds, and they actually help to change people's lives? So Professor Bray, I'm going to ask you that question exactly. What do you think? Is it really a positive or negative phenomenon? Is it a
the answer
from
is
education sector, or is it something that is a valid supportive mechanism that works?
The answer is that it's mixed, and that's why it's problematic, and that's why it needs to be confronted. If it was something like COVID that we really want to eliminate, or other health issues or whatever, then it would be more straightforward and we would have a more united approach to it, and we would mobilize public opinion more clearly. But the answer is that it is mixed. There is bad aspects of it, there are good aspects of it. So then what that means to me is that the two sides need to be pulled apart more carefully. Why this interview with you disseminated to your colleagues and other viewers let them stop to think which aspects are bad, what should we do about it, which aspects are in fact good and may even need to be encouraged. And I'm talking there about parents, I'm talking about school teachers, I'm talking about school principals, I'm talking about school unions, and I'm talking about ministries of education and governments. At the top, you can have regulations. And again, I've written about regulations, and I have a book called Regulating Private Tutoring for Public Good. So how should we regulate it in order to promote the public good? That's another long topic. We'll have to have another interview on that. But it can be regulated. It needs to be put on the table. It needs to be taken out of the shadows for discussion and to see the different facets of it.
Thank you very much. I really wanted this to be the last question, but something now occurred to me. Can I ask you one more question?
Please.
Right. How is the money part of it? So what's the, do you have any information about the pricing of this? Is it, or in which countries it is more affordable than others vis-a-vis, the general income of population? So I really wanted this to be the last question, but it just occurred that maybe it's an interesting topic as well to mention here.
We're talking about a marketplace, and tutors differentiate themselves according to their clients, much like any other aspect. Hotels, you can get a cheap hotel, you can get a medium price hotel, you can get an expensive hotel. Tutors can differentiate themselves according to where they are and who their clients are and what they have to offer. So there's a huge range of prices, and that's also part of the social substructure of how this affects our wider society. It's not just quantity, it's also the quality and the prices of tutoring that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Professor Bray. Thank you very much for your time and for your comments. And now I'm going to turn to our viewers. If you like this content, please put a like, subscribe the channel, and comment. Is shadow education going to overtake education? Can shadow education overtake education? Can shadow education be a proof of failure of public education? All these questions, please comment on this. We can then chat. I think Professor Bray has raised a number of interesting issues here, questions, and I think that to some people he also raised a number of eyebrows at times. So Professor Bray, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining the Education Charter, and let's stay in touch because I'm sure that just this discussion has actually opened up a great number of other topics that we can discuss together. So until then, and thanks a lot for your time.
And thank you too, and to the viewers.